Deep within Maine's remote wilderness, 3 women quietly ran what appeared to be a religious sanctuary for over 3 decades. More than 600 women crossed its threshold in search of spiritual relief, yet fewer than half ever emerged. Those who returned were changed in ways they could not explain. One testimony, held for over 100 years in the sealed records of the Maine State Archives, was considered so horrifying that officials refused to release it publicly. Tonight, that silence ends. We uncover the truth buried behind the thick stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. Before we go further, a word of warning. This isn't a tale for everyone. This channel is for those willing to explore America's darkest, most unsettling history. If you have the courage to face what really happened in the hidden corners of our past, hit subscribe and share your state in the comments. Do you have what it takes to join a community of true mystery seekers? We're about to find out. What sets this story apart isn't religious zealotry or unexplained phenomena, but something even more unsettling, a cold, calculated hunger for knowledge, masked by a veil of pious charity. In the late 1700s, the District of Maine was still part of Massachusetts, a harsh, undeveloped land where scattered settlements fought to survive brutal winters and harder truths. The seaside village of Millbridge, home to just 300 residents, served as a trade post for daring fishermen and loggers who challenged the merciless Atlantic. Roughly 15 miles inland, down unmarked paths once used by native hunters, lay a patch of forest destined to become infamous. On an overcast morning in October 1798, the Ashford women arrived in Millbridge. Their horse-drawn carriage carried mysterious trunks and medical equipment, drawing glances from the wary locals. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford was the first to descend, an elegant figure in her early 40s with silver-streaked auburn hair and steel-gray eyes that scanned her surroundings like a ledger. Her voice bore the clipped tone of upper-class England, her poise reflecting someone used to authority and complete obedience. Next came Sister Prudence Ashford, tall and thin, with ghost-pale skin and hands that moved with eerie precision, like those of a skilled artisan. Her fingers, long and steady, would later prove critical in the darker chapters to come. She rarely spoke, watching the world through unreadable pale blue eyes. When she did speak, her Scottish-tinged voice carried a refined coldness that unsettled even the most hardened frontiersman. Lastly emerged novice Temperance Ashford, the youngest, barely older than 22. Her beauty was immediate and uncanny, raven black hair, flawless porcelain skin, and eyes as dark as secrets. Yet something about her presence set people on edge. Her smile never met her eyes, and mothers instinctively drew their children close as she passed. She studied people not like neighbors or parishioners, but like specimens under glass. The Ashford women presented themselves as Anglican nuns, allegedly fleeing persecution in England to build a new order in the American wild. Their credentials included glowing letters from English clergy, documents later proven to be highly convincing forgeries. Still, their story was believable enough to earn the trust of Millbridge's Protestant settlers, who welcomed their presence as a touch of civility in the frontier's rough life. Backed by gold coins that seemed limitless, the sisters purchased nearly 200 acres of secluded woodland from a struggling widow. They paid 3 times the land's market value, a sum large enough to silence questions and earn eager support from local officials. Without delay, the sisters hired every available craftsman, carpenters, masons, and laborers to bring their sanctuary to life. What rose over the next 8 months, however, confounded the workers. The structure, 3 stories tall, was built from cold gray stone cut from the nearby coast. Its walls were thick enough to swallow sound. Windows were set high and narrow, making it impossible to see inside from the ground. Most baffling of all was the basement, massively excavated, with reinforced foundations far beyond what simple storage would require. When questioned about the building's unusual design, Mother Agatha would smile gently and reply, "Solitude is essential for penitence, and true solitude requires containment. Our sisters in England have learned. Healing begins when the soul is fully separated from the world." Her answer soothed most ears, though a few older workers exchanged uneasy glances. Why, they wondered, did a house of worship need to resemble a fortress? Throughout the construction, the Ashford women oversaw every detail with unnerving precision. They demanded odd features, reinforced doors with heavy locking mechanisms, advanced drainage systems capable of handling immense liquid flow, and air vents more suited to a surgical ward than a sanctuary. When questioned, the sisters claimed these were standard features in European institutions devoted to deep spiritual care. Among their earliest allies was Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a traveling physician in his 50s known for modern medical ideas. He quickly grew fascinated with the sisters, particularly their grasp of women's psychology and emotional disorders. During their first meeting, he was stunned by their articulate analysis of symptoms many doctors of the time barely acknowledged. According to Hartwell, the sisters demonstrated an exceptional understanding of what was then referred to as female hysteria and melancholia. Dr. Hartwell wrote in his journal, was at the center of the sisters' unorthodox yet undeniably brilliant work. Their methods, while unconventional, are founded on sound medical reasoning, approaches that feel years, perhaps decades, ahead of modern American practice. They don't simply treat symptoms. They strive to uncover the underlying causes of mental affliction. What the physician didn't note in his official log was a private agreement he'd made with Mother Agatha, one not rooted in medicine, but money. In exchange for referring difficult cases to the convent and providing access to medical equipment through his network, Dr. Hartwell would receive a generous monthly payment, along with exclusive access to their case files. For a struggling frontier doctor, the offer was far too lucrative to decline. The convent's reputation began to spread quickly through the region. Whispered recommendations reached families not just in nearby towns, but as far as Portsmouth, Portland, and even Boston. Word of the Ashford sisters' remarkable ability to transform unruly or unstable women into obedient and reformed citizens spread like wildfire. Their prices were steep, $20 silver for 1 month, $50 for 3 months, and $100 for what they advertised as complete spiritual reformation. Still, to desperate families facing social disgrace, be it through rebellious daughters, outspoken wives, or women afflicted by visible mental turmoil, these fees felt like a reasonable trade for peace, respectability, and control. The types of women sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears were a mirror to the cultural fears of the time. Unwed mothers who refused to name the fathers of their children arrived alongside wives who had challenged their husband's authority in public. Girls who rejected arranged marriages were delivered to the same place as educated women who dared show interest in literature, politics, or philosophy. The thread that bound these women together was defiance. Any deviation from the narrow mold of acceptable female behavior. Even religious differences played a part. Puritan families sometimes sent daughters who leaned toward Anglican or Methodist ideals, while Anglicans quietly rid themselves of daughters drawn to the fervor of Baptist revivals. The Ashfords welcomed all denominations with the same enthusiasm, claiming that their techniques weren't bound to any church, but guided by the universal strength of Christian discipline. But the first public sign that something was deeply wrong came during a bitterly cold night in February 1803, when Thomas Brewster, a young trapper of 20, was tracking an injured deer in the woods near the convent. He had spent hours in the snow, his senses attuned to every sound of the forest. But what he heard that night was foreign, unnatural, and horrifying. The crack of icy branches, the rustle of snow, the low howl of wolves. Thomas knew these sounds by heart. But this was different. It was unmistakably human. Through the muffled winter air came screams, agonizing, layered, and in waves. At times they dropped into low, defeated moans before rising again into heart-stopping, primal shrieks. His blood turned to ice. He abandoned the deer and crept toward the looming stone structure in the distance. The convent appeared lifeless, no lights, no movement. But as Thomas circled toward the rear of the building, he saw a faint glow leaking from basement windows, nearly hidden beneath the snow. The cries grew louder, more desperate. And then came other noises, the clinking of metal tools, rushed whispers, and, most disturbingly, the unmistakable sound of sawing. Peering through a frost-dusted basement window, Thomas saw something that would scar his memory for life. The chamber below had been turned into a surgical theater. Oil lamps and candlelight cast flickering shadows across the damp stone walls. A woman, strapped tightly to a wooden table, writhed in agony. Her head was fixed in place by a metal device that looked more like an instrument of torture than a medical brace. Sister Prudence, her face flushed with effort, stood over the restrained woman. In her hand, she gripped a long, gleaming metal rod. The patient's hair had been partially shaved, her exposed scalp marked with lines drawn in dark ink. A small portion of her skull had been opened, revealing pale bone, and beneath that, the glistening tissue of her brain. The woman's eyes were wide with terror, her screams piercing, but the most chilling part of the scene was not the suffering, but the calmness of her tormentors. Mother Agatha stood nearby, quietly jotting notes in a leather-bound book as though observing a standard procedure. Novice Temperance moved with quiet efficiency, handing instruments to Sister Prudence like a seasoned assistant in an operating theater. Thomas watched in frozen dread as the rod was carefully inserted into the exposed brain. The woman let out a final scream so raw and powerful it seemed to rattle the stones themselves, before falling into unconsciousness. The sisters continued their work without hesitation, undisturbed by her silence. Thomas turned and ran, stumbling through snowdrifts, blinded by fear. That image, the stone walls, the lamps, the blood, and the eerie precision, was seared into his memory. Most horrifying of all was the clinical detachment, the way the sisters performed their grisly work without cruelty, yet entirely without mercy. He had no doubt what he witnessed was not an isolated event. By the time he reached town the following morning, he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, wild-eyed and breathless. His words came in frantic bursts, about screams, about saws, about something inside that convent far worse than anyone had imagined. Thomas's words came with such frantic urgency that his father began to suspect his son had suffered a mental collapse. The elder Brewster, a grounded man who prized community stability above all, listened with growing unease as Thomas recounted scenes more suited to Gothic horror than any godly institution. He tried to tread gently. "You were out in a blizzard, alone, chasing a wounded deer for hours," he said slowly. "The mind can be cruel in such conditions. Maybe you saw some sort of medical treatment. The sisters are known to handle delicate female afflictions that may appear unusual to the uninformed." But Thomas's descriptions were far too detailed to dismiss as hallucination or confusion. He recalled the layout of the basement, the surgical instruments, and the detached, clinical demeanor of the women performing the procedures. There was no frenzy, no wild violence, only cold, practiced precision. It wasn't madness. It was method. Brewster, alarmed but still skeptical, brought the matter to Deacon Morrison, the town's unofficial moral compass and most respected citizen. Morrison had built a reputation on discretion and balance, serving as a stabilizing force in Millbridge for decades. The Ashford sisters had lived among them for 5 years, always courteous, always charitable, their conduct beyond reproach. They had donated generously to local causes and rarely stepped into the public eye. Even more complicating, several of Millbridge's wealthiest families currently had wives or daughters under treatment at the convent. "We must tread carefully," Morrison warned after listening to Thomas's account. "To accuse women of God of such things, especially without proof, could destroy reputations and unravel our entire town. There may be a rational explanation for what the boy believes he saw." Still, the deacon was too conscientious to ignore a story so disturbing. He agreed to visit the convent under a non-threatening pretense, a discussion about an upcoming church fundraising event that would involve the sisters. He arrived the following week. Mother Agatha welcomed him in the austere parlor, a sparse chamber adorned with a large crucifix and solemn religious art that seemed to scrutinize all who entered. Her demeanor was poised, graceful, and free of tension. She poured tea with ease and asked after his family with what seemed like sincere concern. When Morrison cautiously brought up the rumors, vague stories from hunters about strange nocturnal noises, Agatha's reaction was calm and composed. "Ah, yes," she said in her polished English accent, her expression softening. "We hold intense prayer sessions during the quiet hours for our most tormented souls. The process of spiritual purification can be quite vocal." She spoke of women overwhelmed by sin, by pride, lust, and rebellion. These forces, she explained, did not leave willingly. They fought back against divine correction. "Some arrive with the devil rooted so deeply in their souls," she said with pained sympathy, "that driving it out is no gentle task. What your hunters likely heard were not screams of pain, but demons howling as they're cast out through penance and prayer." The explanation was delivered with such composed conviction and theological clarity that Deacon Morrison, a man well versed in the concept of spiritual warfare, found himself reluctantly reassured. After all, the frontier church did not shy away from the idea that evil could cling tenaciously to the soul, and sometimes required violence to dislodge. Mother Agatha then offered a brief tour of the convent's upper floors. She led him through simple, tidy dormitories where several women sat silently, deep in meditation or prayer. The residents appeared peaceful at first glance, but Morrison couldn't help noticing their movements, stiff, robotic, almost rehearsed. They avoided eye contact, and when they did glance in his direction, it felt as if they looked through him, as if focusing on something just beyond reach. When he inquired about the lower levels of the convent, Mother Agatha offered a regretful smile. "The basement is where we conduct the most intensive spiritual care," she said gently. "I'm afraid it would be highly inappropriate for a man, especially a man of the cloth, to observe such intimate procedures." She continued, "Some treatments require private examination of the soul, and their dignity must be preserved. Our methods are best understood in spiritual terms, not through male eyes." It was a reasonable response, particularly within the era's strict views on gender and modesty. Deacon Morrison left the convent feeling mostly reassured, and yet, as his carriage rumbled away, a faint unease settled in his chest. Something he couldn't quite explain lingered in his mind. The women he saw had been too calm, too still. Their movements lacked the natural spontaneity of everyday life. They reminded him more of sleepwalkers than living, breathing individuals. And there had been a scent throughout the building that stayed with him, a faint metallic tang beneath the sterile odor of soap and herbs. It reminded him of battlefield hospitals he had visited during the Revolutionary War, the thick air of suffering and blood, of wounds both seen and unseen. Following the deacon's visit, the Ashford sisters quietly enacted changes. Security at the convent increased. The blood-curdling screams that had once echoed through the trees were no longer heard. They were replaced by something far more unnerving, a chilling, deliberate silence. That silence, so complete and unnatural, somehow felt more threatening than the blood-curdling screams it had replaced. The Ashford sisters continued welcoming troubled women with open arms, offering increasingly confident claims of transformation and healing. Families kept sending wives, daughters, and sisters to the convent, trusting in its growing reputation. But observant townsfolk began to notice troubling patterns, signs that something about the sisters' treatments was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Women returned from the convent undeniably changed. But these changes didn't resemble healing. They weren't redeemed or uplifted. They were erased, like slates wiped clean. Something had been stripped away. Take Mary Prescott, for example. At 19, she was known throughout Millbridge for her sharp wit, joyful spirit, and defiant independence. She had caused a minor scandal by rejecting 3 respectable marriage proposals. Her parents, weary of her stubbornness, finally enrolled her at the convent. 6 months of spiritual refinement, they believed, would mold her into a marriageable woman. When Mary came back, her parents were overjoyed at first. The transformation seemed miraculous. The once opinionated and headstrong daughter was now calm, obedient, and utterly compliant. She spoke only when spoken to. She showed no preference for anything, not clothes, not meals, not people. She accepted a marriage proposal within a week of returning home, without hesitation or emotion, as though ticking off a task. But within a month, her parents' joy turned to alarm. Mary didn't recognize her childhood toys or favorite meals. She couldn't recall close friends. When shown letters she'd written before her stay, she looked at them like artifacts from someone else's life. Worst of all, she seemed emotionally hollow, no laughter, no tears, no curiosity. Dr. Hartwell, when consulted, called it a success. "The patient's rebellious spirit has been corrected," he said proudly. "She is now fully suited for her role in marriage and society." But Mary's mother was not convinced. During grooming, she noticed faint scars on her daughter's scalp, symmetrical, deliberate, and clearly surgical. Mary, when asked, claimed to remember nothing but prayer. Stories like Mary's became more frequent. More women returned from the convent transformed, their personalities flattened, memories erased. Hannah Morse, grieving her infant son, was sent for melancholia. After 3 months, she came home unnaturally cheerful, insisting she had never had a child. Shown the baby's belongings, she stared at them blankly. Elizabeth Thornton, wife of a respected merchant, had accused her husband of infidelity and demanded a divorce. The scandal shook the family's social standing. She was swiftly committed to the convent for hysteria. For months later, Elizabeth returned with no memory of her accusations, insisting her husband was faithful and her marriage blissful. She even denied ever raising concerns in the first place. Physically, she had deteriorated. Elizabeth suffered from constant headaches that left her bedridden for days. She forgot familiar names, got lost in her own neighborhood, and struggled with basic tasks. And like the others, she bore scalp scars she couldn't explain. Still, Dr. Hartwell continued to endorse the sisters' work with passionate confidence. But those close to him noticed a change. He began drinking heavily and raving about sacrifices for medical progress. His public lectures turned erratic, laced with references to necessary darkness and the price of knowledge. His private journals, discovered after his death, revealed the deep conflict tearing at his conscience. "What I've seen violates every medical oath I ever swore," he wrote. "Yet the results cannot be denied. They can erase trauma, reshape personality, and selectively destroy memory. Their methodology is clean. Their records are exact. Their procedures repeatable." He concluded bitterly, "History must decide whether we are visionaries unlocking the mind or butchers preying on the vulnerable." Around this time, the convent's correspondence with European institutions surged. Postal workers, despite being well compensated for silence, couldn't help but notice the steady flow of crates, letters, and sealed packages arriving from overseas. Rare medical texts, surgical tools, chemicals, and strange instruments came regularly. Outgoing parcels, wrapped carefully and marked biological, hinted at a darker exchange. Mother Agatha began making monthly trips to Boston and Portland, returning each time with crates of complex equipment. When questioned, she explained that the convent was at the forefront of a revolutionary medical-spiritual hybrid, combining European science with ancient Christian healing. Her intelligence, graceful demeanor, and composed assurance made it easy for most to accept her words. Her explanations resonated with a town that respected both spiritual devotion and intellectual advancement. Yet, not everyone was convinced. A few townspeople remained deeply uneasy about the changes they noticed in the convent's patients. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had undergone treatment and returned fundamentally different, began quietly reaching out to other families. What she uncovered was deeply unsettling. None of the women who had received extensive treatment in the convent's basement could recall their experiences. All that remained were fragments, snippets of scripture, vague hymns, and scattered memories of religious lessons. As Martha pressed further, she discovered something more alarming. Several women who had entered the convent for care had simply vanished. When relatives asked about their missing daughters or wives, the Ashford sisters claimed these women had experienced such powerful spiritual breakthroughs that they had chosen to stay indefinitely, devoting themselves entirely to prayer and service. However, families who asked to visit these supposed devotees were always turned away, politely, yet firmly. They were told the women had taken solemn vows of silence and isolation, forbidding any outside contact. The mystery grew deeper when Martha learned that the convent was now receiving women from increasingly distant places. Wealthy families from cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston were sending their most difficult daughters to the secluded institution, paying steep fees and making long journeys in search of complete behavioral transformation. The price for this so-called spiritual reform had surged. The sisters now charged as much as $500 for what they described as comprehensive reformation, a 6-month process that promised full removal of all undesired traits and tendencies. By its second decade, the Convent of Eternal Tears had earned the Ashford sisters widespread recognition as pioneers in the treatment of women's psychological disorders. Their work drew attention from prominent physicians and researchers across both America and Europe. The sisters regularly corresponded with elite medical institutions, sharing case studies and reporting success rates that stunned the academic world. Among their admirers was Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School, who became a long-standing correspondent. For over 15 years, they exchanged letters, many of which are preserved in Harvard's archives. In his writings, Whitmore often expressed awe at the sophistication of their work. Your behavioral correction techniques far exceed anything I've read in European medical literature. The consistency with which you link physical intervention to predictable changes in temperament is beyond our current capabilities. But what Dr. Whitmore didn't realize was that the interventions he praised were crude, invasive procedures, primitive forms of lobotomy, trepanation, and induced brain injury. Through years of unrestricted human experimentation, the Ashford sisters had developed a chillingly advanced knowledge of brain anatomy, something most doctors of their time could only speculate about through animal testing or autopsies. Their methods were methodical and deeply disturbing. They recorded every patient's behavior, personality traits, and mental condition prior to treatment. Each procedure was documented in exacting detail, with post-treatment observations of memory, behavior, and personality changes tracked with clinical precision. It mirrored legitimate scientific research, but was carried out without consent, oversight, or morality. Their surgical expertise evolved drastically. Sister Prudence, in particular, became highly skilled in what she called targeted cranial intervention, pioneering ways to access specific parts of the brain with astonishing accuracy. Decades later, her anatomical sketches revealed an expert grasp of brain structure, complete with measurements, angles, and access points. The operations were performed with such clinical detachment that they were all the more horrifying. Sedation was minimal, typically just enough laudanum to reduce pain, but not consciousness. The sisters needed their patients responsive, so they could observe the effects in real time. They would speak to the women, issue commands, and note behavioral shifts as they manipulated brain tissue with steel tools. Novice Temperance had, by this time, become the resident authority on psychological conditioning. She devised detailed regimens to reinforce surgical outcomes through a calculated blend of reward, deprivation, and emotional control. Her methods included strict nutritional plans, sleep interruption, temperature extremes, and solitary confinement, all carefully measured to dismantle a patient's identity and rebuild it according to a predetermined model. The Ashfords also experimented heavily with chemical compounds. Leveraging their network of medical connections, they secured substances that would not be available to mainstream science for decades. Using the same precise methods as in their surgeries, they tested drug combinations to explore their influence on memory, emotional response, and suggestibility. By 1815, over 400 women had passed through their programs. The sisters kept meticulous statistics, proudly claiming success rates above 90%. Though their definition of success meant the total erasure of the traits that had led to the woman's admission. Those who died during the process were simply labeled as failed outcomes, and their remains preserved for study. As their reputation grew, so did the scale of their operation. The convent began accepting what they called research volunteers, typically women with no social ties or support systems, often vagrants, widows, or prostitutes. These individuals were offered shelter, food, and small payments in return for participating in experimental treatments intended to deepen medical knowledge of the female mind. Records uncovered decades later in concealed vaults beneath the convent revealed the full scale of what had been inflicted upon these forgotten women. The experiments were not only methodical, they were terrifyingly meticulous. The Ashford sisters kept exact measurements of cranial dimensions, detailed notes on neural responses to various stimuli, and careful documentation linking specific surgical procedures to observable shifts in behavior. They corresponded extensively with scholars and physicians across Europe and America, discreetly selling their findings to institutions that either could not or would not conduct such experiment themselves. The letters exposed the existence of a thriving underground market for illicit human experimentation data, with the Ashford sisters at the center, acting as its most prolific and secretive suppliers. One of their most lucrative clients was Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna. He paid handsomely for reports detailing how to suppress memories, dull emotional reactions, and create what he called obedient behavioral states in female patients. His letters, later intercepted by authorities, requested exact protocols for eliminating free will and enhancing compliance, desires the sisters were all too prepared to fulfill. In a dark twist of irony, even the University of Edinburgh, the same school that had once expelled Agatha Brennan for her unorthodox research, unknowingly adopted the Ashford sisters' methods. The information reached them through intermediaries who carefully concealed the origins of the work. The data was then incorporated into medical lectures, embedding techniques derived from unethical human experimentation into the academic canon. But perhaps the most disturbing evolution of the sisters' operation was the introduction of customized behavioral modification. Affluent families began requesting specific adjustments to their troubled daughters, the suppression of artistic passion, the dampening of intellectual curiosity, the erasure of romantic desire, or the full conditioning of submissive domesticity. Each psychological rewrite came with a carefully calculated surgical technique and a high price tag. For nearly 20 years, the sisters maintained a carefully crafted mask of religious purpose and scientific enlightenment. But in the winter of 1818, that mask began to crack. The catalyst was the arrival of a young woman named Sarah Whitman, whose presence would ultimately unravel everything. Unlike the broken, desperate women who were typically sent to the convent, Sarah arrived defiant and unbowed. Her strength had not been crushed by scandal or shame. What condemned her was the birth of a child out of wedlock and her refusal to name the father, despite relentless pressure from her well-connected Boston family. Hoping to avoid public disgrace, they first attempted to force a quiet marriage or private adoption. But Sarah refused. She insisted on raising the child herself and living independently, a decision her parents deemed madness. Declaring her mentally unstable, they arranged her confinement at the convent of Eternal Tears. At just 24, Sarah possessed an unusually sharp intellect, cultivated by her liberal upbringing before her pregnancy made her a family embarrassment. Her father's connections in Boston's medical circles had granted her access to anatomy texts and scientific journals, knowledge that would become vital in understanding the grim reality she found at the convent. From the moment she entered, Sarah realized something was terribly wrong. The women moved with eerie synchronization, their personalities stripped away. Their responses seemed rehearsed, their expressions blank, their eyes hollow. Many bore surgical scars, thinly veiled by regrown hair. Worse still, some displayed unmistakable signs of cognitive damage, slurred speech, memory lapses, and behavior so altered they seemed like different people entirely. Sarah's background allowed her to recognize these symptoms for what they were, not divine transformations, but the result of targeted neurological trauma. Within her first week, she underwent the same assessments that preceded every major treatment: detailed skull measurements, intrusive personal interviews, and bizarre physical tests that appeared designed to chart neural reflexes rather than assess spiritual health. Unlike most, Sarah didn't break easily. The Ashford sisters were used to patients already weakened by public shame or family betrayal. But Sarah was mentally strong, and she resisted every psychological tactic they employed. The sisters escalated their conditioning efforts. She was isolated in dark, cold cells for days. Her food and water were restricted. She was subjected to relentless emotional degradation. Sister Temperance, their expert in mental reprogramming, used every technique at her disposal: sensory isolation, erratic sleep cycles, verbal abuse, temperature extremes, to shatter Sarah's resolve. But Sarah endured. In those long, bleak hours, she studied her surroundings, observed routines, and memorized the layout of the building. She mentally recorded guard rotations and ritual timings. She used her solitude to plan. And, most importantly, she began documenting. Using scraps of discarded cloth and paper, and ink made from crushed berries, Sarah kept a secret journal. She hid her writings in the linings of her garments, sewing them with care. Each entry detailed her observations, the patient's condition, the treatments she endured, the structure of the convent, and the strange medical procedures she believed were taking place beneath the surface of its sacred facade. Her opportunity finally arrived during a violent March storm in 1819. Torrential rains flooded the lower levels of the convent, throwing the daily routines into disarray. Patients and medical equipment had to be hastily moved to higher floors, and the disruption created just enough confusion for Sarah to act. While staff scrambled to contain the damage, she slipped past her handlers and ventured into areas of the building normally off-limits to residents. What she found in the submerged basement confirmed her worst fears. The flooded rooms revealed a grim collection of horrors. Surgical tables fitted with full-body restraints, shelves lined with instruments that bore little resemblance to anything used in traditional medicine, and worst of all, rows of glass jars containing preserved human brain tissue. Each specimen was carefully labeled with names, dates, and clinical notes, a catalog of human suffering hidden in plain sight. The surgical documents she uncovered described methods that amounted to precise, intentional brain damage. Diagrams illustrated exposed skulls, with anatomical markings that identified the exact areas targeted during the procedures. The notes included behavioral observations following each operation, outlining the resulting changes in memory, temperament, and personality with disturbing clinical detachment. Among the most damning evidence were files of correspondence, letters from respected physicians across Europe who had been purchasing the convent's research data. These communications discussed the shipment of specimens and the acquisition of experimental findings as casually as one might order books or supplies. It became clear to Sarah that the convent had long functioned not just as a religious institution, but as a lucrative business enterprise selling human research to clients unwilling or unable to conduct such unethical work themselves. Clutching samples of the evidence she had secretly hidden in her clothes, Sarah began planning her escape. Time was critical. Her name had already been added to the list of women scheduled for advanced treatment, and she understood what that meant. The longer she stayed, the more certain it became that she would join the others, lobotomized, fragmented, and voiceless. The sisters were growing more watchful, sensing that her defiance posed a serious threat to their control. Her chance came on a moonless April night. Taking advantage of a momentary lapse in security, Sarah attacked a guard and vanished into the dense forest surrounding the convent. The Ashford sisters responded swiftly, mobilizing a search party before dawn. They knew that if Sarah reached civilization, everything they had built over decades, every secret, every deception, could be exposed. For 3 terrifying days, Sarah navigated the rugged terrain, living off spring water and wild plants. The sisters, with their intimate knowledge of the area and loyal network of hired help, launched a relentless manhunt. Locals were recruited under false pretenses, told they were searching for a mentally disturbed young woman who had wandered away from care and might pose a danger to herself. Throughout her escape, Sarah could hear their voices echoing through the woods, organized, methodical, and far too close. On the second night, while seeking shelter from a downpour, she narrowly avoided recapture when she stumbled into a search team's path. Only her familiarity with the terrain, gained from visits to her grandfather's logging camp as a child, allowed her to slip away undetected. She spent that night crammed into the hollow of a fallen tree, listening as her pursuers scoured the area around her hiding place. Just when it seemed the tale of the Maine wilderness had revealed all its horrors, Sarah's flight added another layer of dread. If this story sends chills down your spine, share it with someone who craves true historical mysteries. Hit like to support our research, and subscribe for more untold stories buried by time and silence. Now let's find out what happened when Sarah finally reached help, and the dark truth began to unravel. By the morning of the third day, her body was breaking down. Dehydrated, chilled, and barefoot, Sarah was now battling the early stages of hypothermia. Her feet were torn from trekking through underbrush, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. But the thought of stopping was not an option. Her mission was too urgent. The crimes she had witnessed had to be revealed. Her rescue came in the form of Joshua Meadows, a local trapper checking his lines at first light. Startled by the sight of a filthy, wild-eyed woman stumbling from the woods, his first instinct was caution. But Sarah quickly began recounting details. Intimate knowledge of the convent's interior, medical procedures, and hidden chambers that no outsider could possibly fabricate. Her injuries were consistent with her claims. Her fear, palpable and raw, left little room for doubt. Moved by her desperation, Joshua provided her with dry clothing, food, and, most importantly, safe passage to Millbridge. But even as they traveled, Sarah remained terrified. She feared the sisters' reach might extend farther than the wilderness, that they could silence her before she reached anyone with the power to intervene. On April 18, 1819, Sarah Whitman staggered into the Millbridge Sheriff's Office. Her disheveled appearance and disturbing story were initially met with skepticism. Sheriff William Hawthorne, a no-nonsense lawman who prided himself on rational judgment, suspected he was dealing with another traumatized woman driven to delusion by the wild. Her tale of systemic abuse and brain surgery sounded like madness. But Sarah wasn't like others. What set her apart were the specific, verifiable details she shared, things about the convent's architecture and operations that had never been made public. She could describe not just the convent's general layout, but precise architectural details of the basement chambers, locations of surgical instruments, the configuration of equipment, and concealed storage spaces that only someone with direct access could possibly know. More damningly, Sarah had smuggled out several critical documents during her escape: surgical records, correspondence with European medical institutions, and patient logs. Evidence that left no room for doubt about the scale and intent of the Ashford sisters' operations. The first document was a surgical journal meticulously kept over an 8-month period. It outlined procedures performed on 23 women, with each entry written in dispassionate medical language. The notes described skull perforations, targeted destruction of brain tissue, and behavioral monitoring post-operation. Each case included psychological profiles prior to the surgery, detailed operative steps, and a clinical breakdown of the patient's behavioral changes following intervention. One particularly disturbing entry detailed the case of Margaret Fowler, a 19-year-old committed for unfeminine intellectual pursuits, namely, an obsessive passion for reading and abstract reasoning. The surgical objective: to impair brain regions associated with memory retention and analytical thought, while leaving domestic functionality intact. Post-operative assessments confirmed the tragic success of the procedure. Margaret lost all interest in books, her vocabulary became stunted, and her reasoning capacity drastically diminished. The final note read, "Subject now demonstrates suitable feminine docility and lacks interest in pursuits beyond basic household duties." The second document was even more damning: a cache of correspondence between the sisters and Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna. In one letter, Zimmermann negotiated the purchase of extensive research on cranial personality correction for 4,000 Austrian florins. His requests were specific, detailed methodologies for erasing undesirable memories, muting emotional depth, and producing compliant, obedient behavior in female subjects. These communications exposed a vast, hidden network of international researchers who relied on the Ashford sisters for data they couldn't ethically acquire themselves. Among the recipients were universities in Berlin, Paris, and Edinburgh, each receiving regular updates and reports on surgical experimentation that would be outright criminal by any modern standard. The Ashford sisters had effectively positioned themselves as underground vendors of human experimentation data, providing research far too controversial or illegal for public science. The third document was perhaps the most horrifying of all, a catalog listing more than 600 women who had undergone various forms of treatment since the convent opened in 1798. Organized by type of intervention, the entries included annotations of procedures performed and patient outcomes. A majority were marked reformed and returned, women surgically altered and sent back to their families with modified personalities. Others were labeled permanent residents, supposedly by choice, but their whereabouts remained unknown. Most chilling of all were nearly 200 names filed under expired, women who had died during or after treatment, their remains repurposed for continued study. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Sheriff William Hawthorne grasped the scale of the atrocity before him. This was not just malpractice, it was genocide disguised as medicine. He quickly organized a raid on the convent, assembling 15 armed men and dispatching urgent messages to Portland and Boston requesting federal marshals, understanding the gravity of what they were about to confront. But the Ashford sisters had eyes and ears everywhere. Their informants in Millbridge had already warned them. By the time the sheriff's team arrived on May 20th, 1819, the convent was eerily silent. The building had been abandoned overnight. The sisters were gone, vanishing with as much of their equipment and documentation as they could carry. What they left behind was more than enough to expose the truth. Inside, the search party found a site of nightmarish revelation. The basement, once hidden from all visitors, contained a surgical theater equipped with custom-built tools specifically designed for cranial procedures. The walls were lined with labeled jars of preserved brain matter, each tagged with patient names, procedure summaries, and post-operative notes. A false wall in the surgical wing led to a hidden chamber holding 47 human bodies, each preserved in chemicals, each showing evidence of invasive brain operations. Tags on their toes detailed the procedures performed and the behavioral outcomes observed before death. Some corpses were missing sections of the skull, others showed signs of repeated surgeries, evidence not of healing, but of experimentation. Elsewhere, file cabinets overflowed with tens of thousands of documents, surgical notes, personal assessments, behavior logs, and international correspondence. The material painted a horrifyingly comprehensive picture of 20 years of calculated human experimentation, advancing neuroscience decades ahead of its time, but at a cost no ethical society could accept. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, once an early supporter of the convent, was soon confronted with his role in the atrocities. At first, he attempted to rationalize his involvement, claiming it was all in the name of scientific progress. These women, he argued weakly, were already cast aside by society. Their suffering gave birth to knowledge that might save future generations. But when confronted with the preserved bodies, the patient records, and letters that exposed a marketplace of mutilation, Hartwell could no longer maintain the illusion. He collapsed into a psychological crisis. In his final coherent statement to a guard at the Millbridge jail, he disclosed the true identities of the women known as the Ashford sisters, along with the full breadth of their criminal past. The figures once revered as Mother Superior Agatha, Sister Prudence, and Novice Temperance Ashford were, in fact, Dr. Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashford, and Dr. Temperance Ashford. Trained physicians expelled from prestigious European institutions for conducting unauthorized experiments on human subjects. Dr. Brennan had her license revoked in Scotland after multiple patients died during her controversial procedures aimed at curing female hysteria through surgical methods. Dr. Prudence Ashford was expelled from the University of Edinburgh's medical program after being caught performing illegal experiments on asylum inmates, efforts intended to map brain function by inflicting controlled cranial damage. The youngest, Dr. Temperance Ashford, had been a pupil of her older sisters, assisting in the development of psychological conditioning techniques that were used to increase the success rate of their surgeries. In 1797, the trio fled Europe and assumed the fabricated identities of Anglican nuns to continue their research in an environment free from legal and ethical oversight. Over 2 decades, they refined their methods of behavioral manipulation through invasive procedures, acquiring data that most sanctioned researchers could never ethically gather. Their eventual disappearance triggered one of early America's largest manhunts, involving federal marshals, local sheriffs, and even coordination with European officials. Despite the scale of the search, the women had vanished without a trace, leaving behind chilling proof of 20 years of methodical and brutal experimentation on human beings. Investigators later found the sisters had prepared thoroughly for escape, establishing multiple hidden routes from the convent and amassing large amounts of money through their illicit activities. Banking records indicated that they had been transferring funds for years to accounts in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries, with the total amount exceeding $50,000, a sum that would translate to millions today. They had also set up numerous false identities and safe houses across North America and Europe, revealing their escape had been planned well in advance. Shipping documents confirmed that for months prior to Sarah's escape, the sisters had been quietly moving both equipment and documentation out of the convent in preparation for the exposure of their crimes. The full magnitude of their enterprise came to light during the investigation. Over the span of 21 years, more than 600 women passed through their experimental program. Of these, roughly 250 were returned to their families labeled as cured, but all exhibited signs of neurological damage consistent with invasive surgical procedures. Another 50 women were said to have chosen to remain at the convent permanently, though no records of their existence were ever recovered. Investigators concluded they were likely murdered once deemed unfit for reintegration into society, their bodies preserved for further study until they no longer served a purpose. Roughly 200 additional victims were found throughout the convent's hidden chambers, in varying states of preservation. These women had died during experimentation or were killed when their reactions offered valuable data. The careful preservation of their bodies implied long-term comparative study. Beyond the physical evidence, authorities also discovered a disturbing web of collaborators. Dr. Hartwell, once considered a champion of progressive medicine, was just one of many physicians who had sent patients to the convent, providing supplies in return for access to the sisters' findings. Postal workers, merchants, and even local officials had accepted bribes to stay silent. Academic institutions across the United States and Europe were found to have unknowingly incorporated data from the Ashfords' research into official teachings. Surgical techniques and psychological models taught to future generations of doctors had roots in the Ashford sisters' horrific trials, forcing a painful reckoning in the medical world. Families of the victims faced a cruel dilemma: pursue justice and expose the nightmare, or remain silent to protect their reputations. Admitting that their daughters, wives, or sisters had been subjected to such atrocities would mean enduring intense social stigma. Most families chose silence, preferring private suffering over public shame. This collective silence allowed the true scope of the sisters' crimes to remain buried. After just 6 months, the investigation was quietly shut down. Most of the documentation was sealed in government archives, inaccessible for more than a century. The official report merely stated that a trio of women had operated an unlicensed facility and fled, leaving behind evidence of non-traditional medical treatments. Eventually, local residents burned the convent to the ground, hoping to erase the horrors tied to it. The realization that she was the only person willing to publicly recount the horrors she had endured isolated Sarah Whitman from a society that preferred ignorance over discomfort. The truth she carried made others uneasy, and rather than honor her courage, they pushed her to the margins. Eventually, Sarah relocated to California under a new identity, taking up work as a schoolteacher and trying quietly to rebuild a life among strangers. She never married and had only limited contact with her family, many of whom were embarrassed by the scandal her testimony had brought upon them. Yet, she remained resolute. Shortly before her death in 1863, she completed a detailed memoir that would become the most comprehensive account of life, within the convent of eternal tears. Her written words served as a critical record, one that preserved the memory of atrocities others sought to erase and documented the full scale of the Ashford sisters' crimes. As for the sisters themselves, they were never apprehended. Though reports of sightings trickled in over the decades, none were definitively confirmed. Some investigators believe the women continued their work under new aliases in remote corners of the Americas and Europe. Others suspected they were eliminated by former collaborators who feared being exposed. One reported sighting in 1847 described 3 elderly women running a discreet medical clinic for elite clients in Argentina, but the evidence proved inconclusive. The most credible lead emerged in 1856, when a French physician claimed to have encountered Dr. Agatha Brennan in Paris. He reported that she was living under a false name and working privately with female patients suffering from nervous disorders, using techniques alarmingly similar to those practiced at the main convent. By the time authorities acted, however, the woman had vanished, leaving behind only vague traces of a dark and elusive past. The Convent of Eternal Tears remains one of the most calculated and prolonged examples of human experimentation in early American history. The Ashford sisters combined clinical precision with a complete disregard for ethics, creating a research program that expanded medical understanding while shattering countless lives. Their records revealed techniques and insights that mainstream medicine wouldn't acknowledge for decades, but the human toll of that knowledge is beyond measure. This case also laid bare the vulnerability of women in early America. In a society bound by rigid norms and legal blind spots, it became terrifyingly easy for 3 determined individuals to operate unchecked for over 20 years. Cloaked in religious piety and scientific purpose, they exploited the most defenseless under the guise of care and reform. Perhaps the most chilling element wasn't just the crimes, but the silence that followed. Rather than confront what had happened, families, institutions, and government officials conspired to forget. Protecting reputations took precedence over seeking justice. And in doing so, they ensured the victims' suffering was buried with them, forgotten in the name of social order and institutional preservation. The story of the Ashford sisters reminds us how easily noble goals can mask monstrous deeds. When scientific ambition is unmoored from ethical responsibility and directed against societies most vulnerable, the result is not progress, it's horror. The fact that such a massive and organized system of human experimentation was allowed to continue with the silent complicity of doctors, leaders, and communities should serve as a warning. Can such atrocities truly remain hidden for so long? The evidence says yes. It tells us that when knowledge is pursued without compassion, it can lead not to enlightenment, but to devastation. Could something like this happen even today, behind the polished walls of respectability and scientific advancement? History whispers that it could. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe these horrors could remain concealed in plain sight? If this dark tale moved you, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share it with someone who isn't afraid to look into the forgotten shadows of our past. There are more secrets buried in history, more stories the powerful tried to silence. Join us in the next video, where we'll uncover another haunting truth that challenges everything we thought we knew about America.